This brings us to 1446 BC in Egypt at the time of the Exodus. We read Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." Pharaoh rejected the request of God because he said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? And I know not the Lord." Pharaoh was acquainted with many gods, and like the Babylonians, most of them were rooted in the worship of the sun. 3 in particular were mentioned in Alexander Hislop's well-known book, The Two Babylons, in which he writes of Isis, Horus, Seb, that is, the mother, the child, and the father of the gods, in other words, the Egyptian Trinity. In order to steal away the worship of the Hebrews from the one true God and secure their worship to himself, Satan did not, in this example, compel them to worship the sun gods of Egypt. All he had to do was compel them to trample upon the Sabbath, the sign of the worship of the true God, and this he did. And the king of Egypt said unto them, "Wherefore do ye, Moses and Aaron, let the people from their works?" That is, he let the people rest. "Get you unto your burdens." And Pharaoh said, "Behold, the people of the land are now many, and ye make them rest from their burdens." And Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, "Ye shall no more give the people straw to make brick as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. And the tale, that is, the measurement, of the bricks, which they did make heretofore, ye shall lay upon them. Ye shall not diminish aught thereof, for they be idle. Therefore they cry, saying, Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let their more work be laid upon the men, that they may labor therein, and let them not regard vain words." From this passage we can see Moses was allowing the Hebrews to rest on the Sabbath, as the word rest in verse 5 is the word sabbat, which means to keep Sabbath. So Moses was allowing the Hebrews to keep the Sabbath, designating them as the worshipers of the true God. But this infuriated Pharaoh, so much so that Pharaoh commanded or passed a law forcing God's people to labor on the Sabbath in violation of the fourth commandment. To labor on the Sabbath would be a sin, which the Bible defines for us, saying sin is the transgression of the law. Pharaoh was using the force of his authority to compel God's people to sin against God and transgress his Sabbath. This is the very heart of Satan's strategy in securing worship to himself and establishing the rule of his throne. Remember when Satan said, "I will exalt my throne above the stars of God"? Notice that Satan has a throne. A throne is a representation of his government and his laws. And this is how Satan exalts his throne above God. He legislates sin by law. That is, he passes earthly laws that force God's people to break God's law. We read about Satan's throne in the Psalms. "Shall the throne of iniquity have fellowship with thee, which frameth mischief by a law?" His throne is the throne of iniquity, and iniquity is wickedness and sin, the transgression of God's 10 commandments. So when Satan frames mischief by a law, he devises and frames man-made laws that compel others to sin against God, thereby bringing mischief or trouble or persecution upon God's people. And since his servants ye are, to whom ye obey, when God's servants obey the laws that compel them to disobey God's law, they become the servants of the one whom they obey instead of God. Since God has commanded his people, "Hallow my Sabbaths, and they shall be a sign between me and you, that ye may know that I am the Lord your God," it follows that when this commandment is transgressed, those who trample upon the sign of the worship of the true God cannot be identified as his worshipers. But it is in just such cases, when earthly rulers frame laws forcing the people to break God's law, that it is written, "It is time for thee, Lord, to work, for they have made void thy law." Meaning, when heathen nations make God's law void by passing laws that compel people to sin against God, That is where the omnipotent God has drawn a line. And when that line is crossed, God will work to vindicate himself and his laws and his people that obey them. And certainly this was true in Egypt. When Pharaoh commanded a law forcing God's people to transgress the Sabbath, it was at that time God intervened and sent the plagues against Egypt. Once brought in the wilderness, where they could worship God freely, he restated the two commandments that identify the worship of the true God, and said, I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence, through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. The tendency of man to redefine God and the day he sanctified for worship is shown in the sad story of his own people, who no sooner than they were led out of Egypt redefined the one God of the Bible as a multitude of gods. When Aaron said to the people, These be thy gods, plural, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And no sooner was this done than they instituted a new day of worship to these false gods. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Few things must excite Satan more than seeing the professed worshippers of the true God redefine him into an idol of their own imaginations, and redefine his day of worship to that of another day. For these 2 points, the Sabbath and the identity of the true God, have especially been at the center of Satan's endeavors in establishing all his false religions. As the laws of this world become more stringent and hostile to the worship of the true God, we may remember the Exodus and have faith and hope that when laws are passed prohibiting the worship of the true God, that the true God will intervene and deliver his people from this world of bondage and bring them into the heavenly Canaan, where they will be at liberty to worship the Father through the Son on the Sabbath day without any interference.